Yes, Marcus, thank you very much for the introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, let's just get right into it. What we'll be talking about today is a little bit more specific than the presentation that you just saw. We'll be talking about changes that are targeted to a specific part of our marketed drug product, and that's specifically its packaging system, its container closure system. So we're specifically talking about how do we manage change to plastic pharmaceutical packaging systems for approved drug products. Just really quickly to go over the presentation outline, I'll introduce essentially the essentials of change control in this particular situation. We'll walk through a change control process that consists of 4 different steps. Um, hopefully, when we get done at that point, you'll see some merit and see some value in that change control process. And then we'll end the presentation with a quick discussion of the concept of a comparability protocol. So where we start this presentation is we have a marketed drug product, a drug product that has been approved by a regulatory agency and is now being sold in the marketplace. As is the case with all drug products, this drug product is in a packaging system. It is an unfortunate reality of life in the pharmaceutical industry that packaging systems and their materials of construction will undergo changes, not only in product development, but after the product has been registered and when the product is in active commercialization. Now, there's for someone who spent a lifetime in this activity, you realize there's almost the universe of possible changes that can happen. The most obvious one is something happens to one of the materials of construction. So let's say, for example, your bag is a multi-layered bag that has polypropylene as one of the layers. You wake up in the morning, you see you got an email from your supplier that says, you know what, I'm going to change the formulation a little bit about that polypropylene to make it more stable or to make it more flexible or to make it more clear or whatever, make it cheaper or whatever. Or, I'm going to manufacture it at a new site. I'm going to get my ingredients from a different supplier, and so on and so on and so forth. Again, as you begin to list the number of possible changes, the list gets longer and longer and longer. But the fact of the matter is then that change control in a company that either sells packaging or sells packaged drug products is a constant. It's something that happens all the time. Now, when a change like that happens into a packaging system, there's a number of different things that you need to worry about. Is the packaging going to be functional? Do I have to change the manufacturing conditions under which the packaging has been produced, and so on and so forth? But the issue that I want to focus on, the change control issue I want to focus on, is safety. Does the change in the packaging system affect its safety? When we started this thing out, because it's an approved a drug product, the packaging has been accepted by a regulatory agency as being safe. When a change occurs, the logical question is, well, is that packaging system still safe? Is it still safe to use? Is it going to have an effect? Is the change going to produce an effect on a patient that the currently existing packaging did not have? Well, so that's the overriding question. The actual gist of that question, though, is will that change alter the packaging system's leachables profile? In other words, will that change make a difference in terms of those substances that come out of the packaging, migrate into the drug product, and while they're in the drug product may represent a hazard to a patient health? If the change doesn't alter the leachables profile, then the change has no effect on patient safety. If the change improves the leachable profile, so for example, the change eliminates the leachable or reduces the level at which it leaches, then the change has a positive effect on patient safety. And we celebrate changes like that, even though I have to tell you, in all honesty, they're relatively rare. The more common thing that you have to worry about is that the change worsens the leachables profile. In other words, there are new leachables or the levels of existing leachables increase, in which case the change would have an adverse effect on patient safety. So change control from the perspective of the safety implication of packaging it boils down to the simple issue of assessing whether the change impacts the system's leachables profile or not. And we're gonna start out on our adventure here, on our journey here, with the understanding that this is going to be a risk-based strategy for change control. In other words, the magnitude of the change assessment activities and the nature of the change assessment activities is going to be directly proportional to the magnitude of the possible effect on the leachables profile. Well, so this means that if the change is highly likely to change the leachables profile, we're going to have to do a fairly significant amount of work in order to manage that change. On the other hand, if it's likely that the change will have no effect or a minimal effect on the leachables profile, then the amount of work that we need to do to manage the change, to approve the change, will be significantly less. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what this change control process looks like. It's a change control process that essentially has 4 steps in it. Step number 1 is to categorize the change, is to categorize the change in terms of its likely effect on the leachables profile. And in this change control strategy, in this change categorization, we're going to ultimately try to categorize the change into 3 buckets: a trivial change, a moderate change, and an essential or substantial change. Because again, once we've categorized the change, the category is going to dictate what activity needs to be performed in order to manage the change. For example, if the change is trivial, if it's a trivial change, maybe the activity boils down to simply documenting the fact that a change is happening, noting the process by which the change was categorized as trivial, and then immediately going to approving the change. There is no change assessment. That's the value of being able to categorize a change as trivial. On the other hand, a change that's categorized as essential, in other words, a change that's highly likely to alter the leachables profile, the change activity is to generate and implement a testing protocol. The change assessment is to evaluate the test data from the perspective of safety impact and write a report. And then based on that report, the assessment outcome is either to approve or reject the change. So a dramatically different change control process depending upon how the change is categorized. All right, so again, We're speaking about you know trying to group this change, trying to put this change in one of three buckets: a trivial one where the risk is low and the assessment is minimal; a moderate change, where there's a possibility that the leachables profile may change, where we're actually going to have to do a written assessment; and an essential change where the risk is high. The change is likely to have an effect on the leachables profile, in which case the assessment is going to have to require actual testing. All right, so how do we do that categorization of a change? Well, so I'm going to suggest to you that maybe it's a two-stage approach. And the two-stage approach, um, stage one is got nothing to do with the change. It has everything to do with how safe is your packaging system to begin with. The idea here is that if your packaging system is extremely safe, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. If the packaging system is extremely safe, then it can handle more significant changes and still be safe. On the other hand, if the packaging system is borderline safe, yeah, it's safe, but it's borderline, then that system has no buffer. There's no buffer built in. Any change that will change the leachables profile will probably make the packaging system unsafe. So the first stage is to ask yourself, how intrinsically safe is my packaging system? What kind of buffer do I have to deal with? Okay. And again, the way that you answer that question is you revisit the safety information that you have on that packaging system. The question that you need to ask yourself is the information sufficient to perform a stage one categorization? In other words, is the information significant enough, sufficient enough that I can say the change is trivial, moderate, or essential? Yes or no? It's a simple yes or no question. If the answer is yes, well, then you categorize the change. It's as simple as that. If the answer is no, if the answer is, I can't categorize the change just knowing how safe my container closure system is, then you need to perform a stage two categorization, which is based on assessing the change itself. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. How safe is my packaging to begin with? Uh, in order to get this drug product approved, in order to get this container closure approved, you in your regulatory submission, you had to have some kind of toxicological safety risk assessment of extractables and leachables. And in that toxicological safety risk assessment, the concept of a margin of safety should play a very important role. And the margin of safety is exactly what it is described to be. For a leachable, the margin of safety is the ratio of the amount that the patient is exposed to versus the permissible exposure of the leachable. So each leachable will have a margin of safety. The desired scenario is that the margin of safety be greater than one, okay? That the amount of material, the amount of the leachable that the patient is exposed to is less than the permissible exposure. That's the scenario that you want to have happen. So the margin of safety has to be at least one in order for you to make the claim that your container closure system is safe. So this assessment, this step one or stage one assessment essentially says, okay, how big is the smallest margin of safety that you reported for all the leachables associated with the packaging system? So you pick what I call a trigger extractable or a trigger leachable. This is the leachable that has the lowest margin of safety. And the first thing you ask is, will will the change even impact this trigger extractable? If the change won't even impact the least safe leachable, then you can probably categorize the change as trivial. More likely than not, you can categorize the change as trivial. However, if the change impacts this trigger leachable, this trigger extractable, then you ask yourself, okay, how high was the margin of safety for that trigger extractable? Was it greater than 10? Again, if it was great, if the margin of safety was greater than 10, then you can probably change the container closure system fairly significantly before the leachable's concentration increases tenfold and the margin of safety becomes 1. So again, if the margin of safety of the trigger leachable is greater than 10, more likely than not, if it's a trivial change. On the other hand, if the margin of safety is less than 2, more likely than not, any change in the concentration or amount of that leachable is likely to lead to the conclusion that the change will have an effect on patient safety, and more likely than not, it's now an essential. It's an essential change. So you go through this process again to identify those changes that are obviously trivial and those changes that are obviously essential. Okay. What happens if you're in the middle? What happens if the margin of safety of the trigger extractable is in that gray area that maybe it'll have a big effect and maybe it'll not? Well, that's the step 2. That's the stage 2. And now you ask yourself questions about the change. Okay? Because the answers to these questions about the change are going to dictate whether it's a trivial, a moderate, or essential change. And there's 4. There's 4 questions you ask. Where in the packaging system is the change being made? What type of change is occurring? How is the packaging system being changed? And what is the magnitude of the change? Okay, and so we'll walk through each one of these quickly. Okay, dimension 1, where is the change being made? What I mean by this is it primary packaging, direct product content, secondary packaging, or tertiary packaging that's being changed? Well, because primary packaging directly contacts the drug product and is more likely a source of leachables, there's a change to the primary packaging will be higher risk. And it's likely that a change to the primary packaging, it's more likely that that'll have an effect of increasing the extractables leaching into the drug product. Okay. At the other extreme, tertiary packaging, you'll say, for example, you're putting a label on an overpouch. Any change to the tertiary packaging, the drug product is isolated from the tertiary packaging by both the primary and the secondary packaging. That's probably a pretty good barrier. So changes to tertiary packing are likely to be lower risk and less likely to have an effect. Okay, so that's dimension number 1. Dimension number 2 is, okay, what is the change? Are you changing the composition of the packaging? Are you changing the process by which the packaging is manufactured? Or are you just changing the configuration of the packaging? And the answer to these questions will help dictate, again, whether it's a trivial change or a essential change. Dimension number 3 is, how is the packaging system being changed? And there's a number of possibilities. Again, best case scenario, you're eliminating something from the packaging system. It used to be a 5-layered film. Now it's a 4-layered film. Obviously, if you take a layer out, any leachables associated with that layer is going away. So that an elimination tends to be low risk. At the other extreme, let's say you're adding something to the container closure system. It used to be a 4-layered film. Now it's a 5 layered film. You're adding a source of leachables. When you add a source of leachables, you increase the likelihood that there will be leachables in the drug product. So this is a higher risk scenario. So again, change dimension number 3 is you're asking yourself, how is the packaging system being changed? And last but not least, is you're guesstimating. You're estimating what is the magnitude of the change based on 2 things. Is it a big change? Again, what is the magnitude of the change? Or is it, and what is the importance of the item being changed? Okay, again, this is the most qualitative dimension. Maybe when I walk through an example or two, it might be a little bit clearer. Okay, so here's example number 1. We're adding a label to the outside of the solution bag. We're adding a label to the outside of the primary packaging. So we're doing something to secondary packaging. We're adding a label. So again, the change is an adhesive label is being added to the outside of the bag. To make things more interesting, this adhesive label is applied to the bag prior to terminal sterilization. In other words, prior to autoclaving of the bag, which provides a fairly significant driving force for leachables. Terminal sterilization, autoclave 121 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes to an hour. That's going to drive leachables through the bag. And it's a fairly big label. It covers roughly 20% of the bag surface area. Okay, so let's walk through the 4-dimension categorization process and see where we end up. I think you probably have a sense as to where we're going to end up, but let's do it anyway. Okay, so where is the change? The change is to secondary packaging. Okay, so dimension number 2. What type of change is it? Well, it's not a process change and it's not a configuration change. It's a compositional change. We're changing the composition of the packaging system. And how is the change being made? We're adding a new component to that packaging system. We're adding an adhesive. Okay, and the fact, and so how big is the change? The adhesive label is 20% of the bag surface area, so it's a pretty darn big label. It's applied before terminal sterilization, so there's plenty of thermal driving force for leachables to get through the container closure system. More likely than not, the plastic container closure system is somewhat permeable, so it's a major. So it's the addition of a major component, and so where we end up when we go through this process is categorizing the change as an essential change, a high risk essential change. Now, what you have to appreciate is what I've shown here in this picture is one part of a much larger matrix. Again, it's a much larger matrix because there are much other answers to the question of where is the change. Okay, now we're going to deal with a second change. We're going to increase the amount of an antioxidant in the bag's outer layer. Okay, so the bag's outer layer is polypropylene, and this polypropylene contains an antioxidant in it. And the vendor of that polypropylene says, you know what, I sell to a number of different industries, not only in the pharmaceutical industry, and the customer that buys a vast majority of my resin has been complaining that the material is not stable for long enough. They need a longer shelf life. So I need to add more antioxidant to this material. So again, the solution bag is multi-layered. We're changing the outermost layer of the bag, which technically is not solution contact. The antioxidant is already in the polyethylene. So it's not like we're adding a new antioxidant. We're changing the proportion from 0.1% to 0.15%. Okay, so again, going through the process, the changes to the primary packaging. So it's a little bit more important change for this one dimension than the putting the label on the bag. Again, it's a compositional change. We're changing the composition. We're adjusting an existing component. We're not adding a new component. We're not substituting a new component. We're not replacing the component. We're just adjusting an existing component. And the fact of the matter is, change from 0.1% to 0.15% in terms of an antioxidant is really a minor compositional change to this polyethylene. The sum of this process allows us to categorize the change as a trivial change with a minor risk. So I've illustrated how the process results in both a trivial and an essential change. Okay, so now we've got the change categorized. You would think, wow, I've done all this work. I'm done. No, actually, you're just setting yourself up now for what activity do I have to do to manage this change? And again, the activity depends upon the category. For a trivial change, I would suggest that the only activity that needs to happen is you document how you got to trivial, and that is your entire activity. You document it. There is no assessment. It's a trivial change. You approve the change. Okay. If you end up in essential, again, I think that it's logical that when the change is categorized as essential, we're going to have to do some extractables testing in order to establish whether that change uh, impacts the extractables profile and how big that change is. So the change activity is do an extractable study. The change assessment is to do a toxicological safety risk assessment of the changed extractables and write your testing report. In the middle, I would suggest that before you immediately jump into extractables testing, which is generally long term and pretty expensive, that you consider the possibility that you can manage that change by using relevant information. And what do I mean by relevant information? Let's say, for example, in the case of increasing the amount of antioxidant in polypropylene, you have a vendor. The vendor of that polypropylene is good to work with. So they've qualified that change by that changed material by noting that it complies with the compendial, that it's biocompatible, that it's an indirect food additive, and so on and so forth. They give you a lot of good data that suggests to you that even if a change in extractables profile occurs, the change is probably not going to impact patient safety. Maybe the preponderance of evidence. This is what I'm suggesting. Maybe if you were in the court of law, the preponderance of evidence is sufficient that you don't have to do extractables testing, and all that you need to do is write this preponderance up in a special report. Okay? Change categorization, change activity, change assessment. Okay. And what is the outcome? Well, there are only two. You either accept the change or you reject the change. So again, I've proposed, and I think it's a reasonable proposition, that a trivial change, a change that's categorized as trivial, should always be accepted. A change that's categorized as moderate can be accepted if the preponderance of evidence suggests that it's safe for use. If the preponderance of evidence suggests that there's any chance that it might be unsafe for use, then you're stuck performing extractables testing. You're stuck going to what is essentially an essential change. What this arm essentially tells you is when you did the a change categorization, you underestimated how big the change really was. And if you are stuck in the essential change after you've done the toxicological safety risk assessment of new extractables or increased extractables based on the outcome of that toxicological safety assessment, either you conclude that the changed packaging system is safe for you, in which case you accept the change, or unfortunately, that the um, changed container closure system is unsafe for use, in which case you have to either mitigate the change or reject it. Okay, so the risk-based change control process for packaging that hopefully eliminates the need to do extractables testing or leachables testing to manage change, with the idea that extractables testing is only necessary only in the high risk situations. Now let's take a step back and talk a little bit about a comparability a protocol. And let me describe to you what a comparability protocol is. A comparability protocol is essentially an outline, a procedure, a specification that defines how the change control activity is going to be performed. Okay, so it's a protocol that with whose titles is a change control and packaging systems or something to that effect. In other words, you've locked yourself in to a change control process, and that process is embodied in a comparability protocol. Well, so the interesting thing is the concept of the comparability protocol was established by the FDA to manage changes in marketed drug products. And what FDA was trying to do was it was trying to make it easier for industry to manage changes by generating a comparability protocol. Generally speaking, comparability protocols were developed to manage changes to the actual drug product. But there is language in the comparability protocol, draft guidance that speaks to the utilization of comparability protocols to manage changes to packaging and specifically to the components used in packaging or the processes by which packaging systems are changed. Okay, so what's the great thing about the comparability protocol? Well, the great thing about the comparability protocol is if a comparability protocol is submitted to the FDA as part of an NDA and an ANDA or a BLA application, the comparability protocol becomes a contract or an agreement between you and the FDA. And the terms of that agreement is you will perform change control exactly as you have described it in the comparability protocol. So the comparability protocol may include a change control process, just like I described in the first part of this presentation, how you decide whether you need to do extractables testing or not. Okay, so if you perform change control in a comparability protocol that was in a NDA, NDA, or BLA that the FDA approved, the FDA will agree to provide expedited and generally favorable review of the change. In other words, the FDA will, in granting you approval, the FDA will have, in theory, reviewed the comparability protocol, approved the comparability protocol, and essentially said to the sponsor of the NDA, if you follow your comparability protocol, we will give you expedited review. And if when you follow the comparability protocol, you conclude that the container closure system change is safe, we will likely agree with that outcome. So that's the value of a comparability protocol. I'm a strong advocate of a comparability protocol. Baxter, as an organization, entered a new reality in terms of managing change control when it began to implement the idea of including comparability protocols in regulatory submissions. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I note that a copy of this presentation and presentations on other topics are available on the Sotera website. Thank you again. And Marcus, let's get at questions.